In this chapter, we're going to talk about folders and organizing subtools using folders inside of ZBrush. We find our folders by going to the Tool menu and opening up the Subtool palette. And here you see that the skeleton, which is composed of various subtools, is organized into folder systems. So for example, if I go to the top level here, and if you don't see as many folders as you want to see, you can change your visible count using the slider here, and that changes how many subtools are visible at one time. I'll turn this up so we can see all the folders at once. If I want to scroll up and down the list, I click this orange button here, and I can drag the slider up and down. Now the first folder are teeth. If I click that, you see that we've got the upper and lower dentals as two separate subtools, and these are inside the teeth group folder. If I click the folder again, it collapses. If I open up skull, you see we've got the cranium and the mandible. The folder has a name, and the two subtools within there have names as well. Right arm, you see we've got all the bones of the right arm in here. Some of those have actually been mirrored across. Right leg, here you see we've got these, all as separate subtools within this folder. Here I've got a merged version of the folder, and I'll show you how to do that in a moment. Shoulder girdle left, the cervical vertebrae, the thoracic. If we grab this slider and drag this down, we can see everything inside there now. You see we've got each individual vertebrae as actually a separate subtool. So this keeps things from becoming very unwieldy and difficult to work with, because we can arrange multiple subtools inside of folders and make it a whole lot easier to navigate our tool. If we open up lumbar and pelvis, once again, we've got the lumbar vertebrae and the pelvis separated out, as well as the lumbar discs. Now, one of the nice things about folders is it allows you to perform operations on subtools that would otherwise be a little bit difficult. So for example, if we go to the right arm group here, and I click the gear icon, now you can see these folder actions. The first one is transpose set. Now, if you've watched the video on transpose gizmo, you know that you can actually move multiple subtools using the transpose gizmo. This makes it easier to select all the subtools in this folder and make a transpose set from them. So if I just click this button, you see it drops me into transpose, and now every subtool that was inside that folder is in a transpose set, so I can move them all together. Of course, I can rotate them and scale them as well. Now that pivot is going to be in the center of all those subtools. So if I hold down the Alt key, I can click and drag the corner points, and I can move this pivot so it's where I want it to be for that particular rotation. Now let's say I wanted to add to my group. If I, for example, wanted to move the skull as well around that same pivot, which wouldn't make sense on the skeleton, but it does illustrate this point. If I click the gear icon, I can click transpose add. Now that adds everything inside the skull group to that transpose set. So now not only am I moving the arm, I'm moving the skull as well. If I want to exit out of this transpose all function, just click the stack of pizza boxes here, and that exits out of transposing subtools. So let's go to the skull, click the gear, click transpose set. So now I have a transpose set for the skull. Now it makes a lot more sense to add the teeth to this, so I will go to teeth grouped, click the gear, and I will click transpose add. Now that adds the teeth to that group. Hold down the Alt key and click any of these corners, and I can move my pivot point, and now I can rotate the skull and the teeth together. Now if we click that gear again, you see there's some other options here. I have transpose sub. If I click transpose sub, that will subtract from that transpose group. So now you see I just have the teeth. We also have the ability to duplicate our folders, so this is quite handy. If we go to, say for example, let's grab something that's not that is bilaterally symmetrical. We'll go to right arm. We'll exit out of our transpose group. And here we go. I've got a merged leg here. So if I go to focus, you see that this subtool here, if I turn on solo, that is all the bones of the leg merged together. I'm going to click delete to delete that subtool. And now I'm going to open up right leg. Let's turn off solo. Now here in the right leg folder, you see we've got the femur, patella, tibia, fibula, the tarsals, metatarsals, and phalanges. So what I want to do is duplicate this folder. So if I click the gear next to right leg and click duplicate, this will duplicate the entire folder and the subtools. So if I click OK, I have now duplicated that folder. If I scroll down, you see there is another folder called right leg. If I click the gear icon again and click delete all, I can delete all of those subtools and the folder. If I click delete folder, it will only delete the folder and leave the subtools. So if I want to get rid of everything, click delete all, click OK, and now we have removed that extra folder. Now let's say I want to duplicate all of these, but I don't want them as separate subtools. I'd just like to merge this down. Click the gear icon and select merge folder. Now this is very handy because it merges all of those subtools into a single mesh. So I'll collapse right leg, and here you see I've got merged. Turn on solo mode. Now I have a merged version of all the subtools inside of there. So now it's very, very simple for me because it's already hidden the folder this came from. With this new merged subtool open, I could come down here to the deformation menu, and there is a mirror button here. If I click mirror, it will mirror that leg across. So then if I go back to my subtools and turn on visibility on right leg, turn off solo, we've got both legs now. We have the ability to merge up, and that will merge the folder with the folder above it. Show polypaint and hide polypaint, that will show and hide polypaint on all the subtools in a folder. So if you have a very complicated Z tool with a lot of polypaint, this is a very nice and easy way to show and hide it so you can just see your sculpture or see your painting. Now we have these two Boolean options. We'll talk about these in just a moment. I have a Z tool specifically set up for that. Merge folder will merge the folder down. Rename allows me to rename the folder. So right now this is shoulder girdle right. I could rename this as just shoulder girdle. Hit enter, and now that has renamed that folder. You've already seen delete folder and delete all. So let's take a look at moving these folders around. Let's say I want to change the position of this folder in the stack. If I just click the folder and drag it, you see I get this blue arrow. That blue arrow tells me where this is going to be placed in the hierarchy. So if I bring it over here and put it above the Z tool, the subtool, you see I've got the option to put it above or below this particular subtool. Folders, it allows me to just move them up and down. And if I drag to the very, very top, it'll scroll. Drag down here to the bottom, get it just right, it'll start to scroll. There you go. And then we can change our positioning of this. I'll just place it at the bottom, and there we go. So let's take a look now at how we can use folders with Boolean operations. If you haven't seen the Boolean chapter yet, we have a whole chapter that deals specifically with Boolean operations inside of ZBrush, which are extremely powerful for creating new and... So I'm going to change to a different Z tool now. I have this Z tool here, which is a hard surface model with a variety of Booleans associated with it. So if you look up here at the top of the screen, I have Live Boolean turned on. And if I turn this off, now we can see the various subtools that I'm using for Boolean subtractions. If I turn that back on, you see the shapes change. You see what we're actually getting. If I go into frame mode, we can actually see the currently selected Z tool, which are Boolean subtract Z tools. You can see them in wireframe where they're placed on the object. If I turn off frame mode, then you'll just see the effect those Booleans are having. So let's take a look at this in action. First, we've got this folder here, breathing apparatus. I've got all the various subtools that make up the head here. Now, if you have seen the Boolean video already, you'll understand that any time I've got this option here turned on, these two little circles together, that's just a union. That's just the object as it is. However, this option here is subtract. So this subtool is set to subtract from the subtool above it. So if I turn this on to just normal mode, you can see that these are just mechanical shapes that I have set to subtract. Here as well, I have all these little tubes. You see these right here in the front of the face mask. If we zoom in on that, you can see that more clearly. If I turn this back on to subtract, you can see that those subtract out the negative space of themselves from the breathing apparatus. So folders allow us to very, very quickly apply all these Booleans and create a new mesh. So we no longer have to rely on live Boolean. We can bake this down into actual geometry. So let's take a look at how to do that. We come down here to the ear housing. The ear housing folder has a variety of tools in here. And if I turn off live Boolean, you can see this is the shape that we're talking about right here. So I'm going to go ahead and select this tool. And I'm going to turn off visibility on these two folders here. So the only folder that's visible is this folder. If I want to bring them back, just click the eyeball next to them and it brings them back. It's a very, very handy way to show and hide multiple tools at a time. So if you turn on live Boolean, you can see the difference. That's what's happening. We're using these parts as subtraction objects so we can create a more complicated form. Now, if I want to turn this into actual physical geometry and not a Boolean, what I do is I click the gear icon and I have the option to Boolean folder. So if I click Boolean folder, ZBrush will process it and then it will give me a new subtool called UMesh and it automatically hides the previous folder. So here, if I turn off live Boolean, select the UMesh, and there we go. If I go into frame mode, you can see that this has actually been Booleaned as geometry. Of course, this can be remeshed to clean it up. We have a whole chapter just on remeshing and ZRemesher. Turn off frame mode with Shift F, and there we go. Now we also have the option to Boolean using dynamic subdivision levels, and dynamic subdivision levels are very handy. It's a means of smoothing an object without having to add subdivision levels. And the reason that you might want to do that is perhaps you're using mesh insert brushes, which have to work on a model that only has a single subdivision level. So if I go to B for brush, or excuse me, go to W for move, press the gear icon here. I'm going to turn this polystar into a polycube. There we go. Let's focus in on that and go into shift mode. So here you see we've got an unsmoothed cube. If I were to go to my geometry menu, and if I were to add a subdivision level with Control D, and then try and use an insert mesh brush, let's say B for brush, I for insert, we'll insert, let's insert something interesting from the model kit. If I try and insert, it's going to say the mesh is composed of multiple subdivision levels, delete, and try again. That's because insert mesh brushes only work on a mesh that has a single subdivision. So I will undo adding that subdivision. I will turn on dynamic subdivisions here. Now, dynamic subdivisions are created. Another way you can do this, by the way, is if you press the D key, that's D as in divide, while you do not have any subdivision levels active. So ZBrush determines you have no subdivisions because D, of course, is the hotkey to step up your subdivision levels. And if you don't have any, ZBrush will ask you if you want to add dynamic subdivisions. So you can say yes or always yes. And now we've got dynamic turned on. You can change the number of subdivision levels here. You can change the methodology of them. Thickness we'll talk about in the chapter on dynamic subdivision levels as well as cloth. But the important thing to understand here is we have smoothed this model. However, we don't actually have subdivision levels added to do it. They are dynamic. They are sort of a trick inside of ZBrush, a temporary subdivision that allows us to use tools like this. So if I click and drag now, I'm able to use these brushes. So let's add a few pieces here. So these will be just Boolean adds, okay? Now let's say I want to do a few subtraction objects. I will append a polymesh star. That just adds a polymesh star in. I'll click to select that tool, bring up the gizmo and the gear icon, and we'll turn this in. So now I have a poly cylinder in here, and let's scale that up. Scale it down. Now this is very, very faceted. So I'm going to press the D key to turn on dynamic subdivision levels, and you see that smooths that shape. All right. So now we'll turn off frame mode. So now I have a dynamic smoothed cube with some Boolean addition, or not Booleans, pardon me, some mesh inserts. And I have a dynamically smoothed cylinder. And I'm going to put both of these into a folder. So let's go ahead and select the top one and click new folder. And I'm going to name this folder Boolean. You can name it anything that you want. And then I'm going to click this tool here and drag, and you see I get those same blue arrows, and I can place this in here. I'm going to place it beneath that cube tool, and I'm going to turn on Boolean subtract. Now if I turn on live Boolean, you'll see that that subtracts that cylindrical shape out of the mesh. If I press Shift D and then turn off my dynamic subdivision levels, you see what happens here is it becomes faceted again. If I select the cylinder, which is subtracting, and press Shift D, you see now we get facets there. If I press D again and turn back on dynamic subdivisions, we get smooths. So what this option here under the gearbox, the Boolean with dynamic subdivision levels, allows me to do is Boolean this taking into account those dynamic subdivisions. So if I click that, here you see we've got our Boolean UMesh, and it's been generated taking into account those smoothed levels. So I don't have to actually subdivide the mesh for this to work. I can just use my Booleans with my dynamic subdivision levels. So let's just take one more look at how to create and organize folders for ourselves. I'm just selecting this polymesh star, and I will change this into a polysphere. I will click the new folder button here, and I will call this folder test. Now I can, let's say, load up another Z tool. I'll go to the light box, and under tools, I'll load up the dog Z tool. Close the light box. Let's go back to our sphere here, and I am going to append by clicking the append button the dog as a subtool. Select the dog. Now, if I collapse that folder, you see the dog is not inside the folder, but if I click and drag, I can add the dog to the folder. If I have the dog selected and I duplicate it, it duplicates and remains inside the folder. So if I were to transpose move this off center, so we have two dogs, we have two dogs. If I select the sphere here, and let's scale this up, I now have two dogs and a sphere. If I click the folder again, I can collapse it. Click the gear icon, go to Merge Folder. Now we've got a single Z tool, which we're currently looking at because it has hidden visibility on all those subtools inside of that folder. So there is my merged version. If I go into frame mode, you can see those three subtools are actually a single. And I think the most important part is the more complicated your Z tools get, the easier it is to open them and navigate them if you have folders. It's just like naming your layers in Photoshop. It takes a little bit of extra time, but if you get in the habit of doing it, it will make your life so much easier. So remember, if you have not named your folders, you can always come down to Rename Folder, and you can change this to whatever you like. So we'll call it Folder Renamed, and we have now renamed that folder. Another thing to keep in mind too, when you're working with folders and subtools, always make sure everything has a different name. I always try and make sure that my names are done in camel case, where each word is written with an uppercase, that's folder, and then uppercase R renamed. And I make sure that nothing has a duplicate name, because some Z scripts can be thrown off by that. So it can be a problem sometimes. For example, I think Transpose Master has an issue if you have Z tools with the same name. So just be aware of that. So keep your folders and your subtools named separately. So I hope you've enjoyed this video on folders inside of ZBrush, and I hope you're able to take this going forward and incorporate it into your own workflow. It's very powerful and very useful in keeping yourself organized and working efficiently. So thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next lesson.